The children of Archduke Franz Karl and Princess Sophie of Bavaria may be some of the most significant figures in history. Their eldest son, Franz Joseph, ruled over Austria-Hungary for nearly 68 years, presiding over the Habsburg Empire's reconstitution into a dual monarchy and its doomed entrance into World War I. Franz Karl and Sophie's second son, Maximillian, was the Emperor of Mexico for 3 years until his execution by Mexican Republicans in 1867, and their third son, Karl Ludwig, fathered Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination ultimately triggered the First World War, and Karl I, who went on to become the last Habsburg Emperor. Perhaps less known is the couple's fourth and final son, Ludwig Viktor, whose eccentric lifestyle, refusal to marry, and his involvement in an altercation at a men's bathhouse led to his banishment from the imperial court. Princess Sophie of Bavaria gave birth to her last child in Vienna's Hofburg Palace on the 15th of May 1842, 2 years after her youngest child and only daughter, Maria Anna, died from epilepsy when she was just 4. Ludwig Viktor's childhood was typical of a Habsburg prince. He pursued a military career where he was eventually appointed General of the Infantry, but the Austrian Archduke had no real interest in the army, nor in the matters of politics and governance that consumed his older brothers. Instead, Ludwig Viktor dedicated himself to the finer things in life. He collected art and literature, and he established his own salon where the composers, painters, and writers of Vienna gathered to discuss books, music, and culture. Ludwig Viktor was so set in his distinct lifestyle that he flatly refused to marry any of the brides that his Habsburg family suggested, which is saying a lot given the very existence of the far-reaching Habsburg Empire was thanks in large part to the dynasty's countless marriage alliances. His first serious marital candidate, favoured by his mother, was the Bavarian Duchess Sophie Charlotte, who was a granddaughter-in-law of France's King Louis Philippe and the youngest sister of Empress Elizabeth, the wife of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. Ironically, after the marriage plans between Sophie Charlotte and Ludwig Viktor fell through, Sophie became engaged to her cousin King Ludwig II of Bavaria, but after having to repeatedly postpone the wedding date, the Bavarian king eventually cancelled the wedding, likely because of his homosexuality. Sophie Charlotte eventually married Prince Ferdinand of Orléans in 1868, with Ludwig II unexpectedly attending the reception. Later, in 1863, Maximillian, who was about to become Emperor of Mexico, attempted to persuade his brother to marry the daughter and heir of Brazil's Emperor Pedro II, in the hopes that he could establish a Habsburg dynasty in Latin America. Even though Ludwig Viktor himself rejected the plan, Maximillian went so far as to ask Franz Joseph to order their younger brother to marry into the Brazilian line of succession, but the Austrian Emperor eventually refused. As a young man, Ludwig Viktor also commissioned the Palace of Ludwig Viktor, which became a major hub for the Archduke's art exhibitions and his famous soirees, some of which were reportedly exclusively for gay men. In fact, Ludwig Viktor's sexuality was said to have been an open secret within Viennese court society. Although Franz Joseph's strict press censorship facilitated its public suppression, since homosexuality was illegal across the Habsburg Empire, Ludwig Viktor scarcely concealed his lifestyle in private. The Archduke dressed up in women's clothing for theatre performances, and he regularly visited some of Vienna's most famous male bathhouses, sometimes as a way to meet up with other gay men. It was during one of these visits to Vienna's distinguished central bathhouse that Ludwig Viktor made one of the most disastrous decisions of his royal life. Once Ludwig Viktor had checked into the bathhouse and walked through its opulent arches, he was settling into the central pool when a young man sitting nearby caught the Archduke's eye. It's said that when Ludwig Viktor approached the man, who may have been a fellow aristocrat or a common bath attendant, the Archduke was dramatically slapped across the face. The Austrian noblewoman Princess Eleonora Fugger recorded the event in her memoirs in 1932, writing that one fine day a real scandal came to pass, a brawl in a public bath. It was said that the Archduke had had his ears boxed and had been forced to take to his heels. This scandalous affair was reported to the Emperor, naturally in the most lurid colours. Outraged, he ordered his brother to leave Vienna immediately. When Franz Joseph heard about the scandal, he decided that Ludwig Viktor had to go. According to the writer James Conway, a pamphlet written by Max Reversi in 1923 even alleged that Ludwig Victor's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, had been the chief architect of the Archduke's ruin. In the pamphlet, Reversi claimed that at the time of the incident, Archduke Ludwig seems to have lost any sense of what was permissible. Perhaps he wanted to enjoy his life one more time before he was caught by the already palpable grip of dark forces, forces that seek to destroy anything which casts doubt on their teachings. Reversi goes on to assert that once Ludwig Victor made his blunder in the bathhouse, Franz Ferdinand rushed to tell Franz Joseph. Although there is no proof that Franz Ferdinand did mastermind the brawl, the pair's relationship had been strained for years. Franz Ferdinand was reportedly appalled at his uncle's lifestyle, and Ludwig Victor was supposedly one of the most outspoken opponents to Franz Ferdinand's controversial marriage to the non-royal Czech noblewoman Sophie Kotek. Either way, once the emperor found out, the consequences were swift. Ludwig Victor was banished from Vienna and was sent to spend the rest of his life in Schloss Klesheim, a grand Baroque palace near Salzburg where he continued his patronage of the local art scene. The exiled Ludwig Victor was declared mentally incapacitated in 1915, and he was placed under a form of guardianship in the palace. The 76-year-old Archduke eventually died in 1919, 3 years after his brother Franz Joseph's death, and just a year after the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself fell apart. Instead of a traditional Hapsburg burial in Vienna's imperial crypt, Ludwig Victor was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery near his adopted home of Salzburg.